It was a quiet afternoon, the kind of day where everything seemed to slow down, and the world felt calm. On a tree-lined street, a pregnant woman sat in a wheelchair, her hands resting gently on her lap as she made her way down the sidewalk. She was alone, moving slowly, each turn of her wheelchair a careful decision as she maneuvered over the uneven ground. She had been feeling more tired lately, her pregnancy making every step feel heavier than the last, and today was no different. As she made her way along the road, she noticed a police car approaching in the distance. She couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. It wasn't the first time she had been out and about with her wheelchair, but there was something about today that made her feel like someone was watching. She wasn't used to the attention, especially not in a situation like this. She knew that people often stared, unsure of how to react when they saw someone with a disability, but this felt different. The police car slowed down as it neared her. The officer inside glanced at her briefly, his eyes quickly moving back to the road. But for some reason, he didn't keep driving. The car stopped, and the officer got out. The woman felt her heart race just a little faster. There was something in the officer's body language that made her anxious. Maybe it was the way he stepped out of the car with purpose, or perhaps the fact that he didn't seem to be in a hurry to continue on his way. But whatever it was, the feeling of unease in her stomach began to grow. The officer took a few steps toward her, his boots clicking on the pavement with each stride. She tried to calm herself, taking a deep breath and reminding herself that she had done nothing wrong. But as the officer came closer, she felt a chill run down her spine. He was now standing directly in front of her, looking down at her. There was no warm greeting, no recognition of her condition, just a cold, unsettling presence. "Are you okay?" the officer asked, his voice firm but not unkind. The woman nodded, trying to keep her voice steady as she responded. She explained that she was just out for a walk, that she was fine and didn't need help. But the officer's eyes seemed to narrow, and his posture stiffened. Something wasn't right. The woman could sense it. The officer looked around, almost as if assessing the situation, before his gaze fell back on her. "Why are you out here alone?" he asked, his tone now slightly more aggressive. The woman's heart skipped a beat. She was used to people asking questions, even strangers sometimes, but something about this man's tone sent a wave of discomfort through her. She tried to explain again, her words slightly more urgent now, but the officer didn't seem to be listening. Instead, without warning, he reached out, his hand grabbing her wheelchair. The woman flinched, her instincts kicking in. She wasn't sure what was happening, but it felt wrong. She struggled to keep her composure, her voice shaking now as she demanded to know why he was touching her wheelchair. This wasn't supposed to happen. She wasn't supposed to be in this situation. But here she was, a pregnant woman in a wheelchair, confronted by a man who seemed to have no real reason to be aggressive toward her. And what was worse, she didn't know how to make it stop. She wasn't strong enough to stand up for herself the way she wanted to, not in this condition, and certainly not with the officer standing over her like this. Her pulse quickened. She tried to stay calm, but the situation was rapidly slipping out of her control. The pregnant woman's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest as she tried to process what was happening. The officer's grip on her wheelchair was unrelenting, and a sense of panic began to settle in. She had no idea what he wanted from her or why he was acting this way. It was as though he had decided that she was a threat, even though she had done nothing to provoke him. The confusion was overwhelming. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling with fear. She tried to push herself back, but with the officer standing so close and his hand firmly holding the wheelchair, it was impossible to move away. The air around her felt thick, like every second dragged on longer than it should. The weight of the moment was almost too much to bear. The officer said nothing at first, his eyes focused on her as though he was evaluating something. He seemed to be studying her, but there was no recognition of her vulnerability. She tried again, this time speaking more firmly. "I'm just trying to get home. I haven't done anything wrong." She could feel the sweat forming on her brow, her body tensing as she desperately searched for a way out of the situation. Still, the officer didn't answer. Instead, he began to look around, glancing down the street as if waiting for something or someone. The woman's anxiety grew with every passing second. She wanted to scream for help, but she couldn't risk it. She didn't know what the officer might do next. His silence was more terrifying than anything he had said so far. She was at his mercy, and that made her feel helpless. A few moments passed before the officer took a step back, but not to let her go. He seemed to be considering his next move. The woman could see the uncertainty in his eyes, but it did nothing to ease her fear. She had no idea if he was going to let her go or if he was planning something else. His presence made it hard to breathe. Just as she began to wonder if the officer had forgotten about her, a voice broke through the tension. It was a voice filled with authority, unmistakable, and strong. The woman's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the tone. Her husband's voice. Her husband, an FBI agent, had been nearby. He had seen what was happening from a distance and immediately sensed something was wrong. He was trained to read situations like this, to stay alert and ready for anything. As soon as he realized the officer's behavior, he wasted no time. His protective instincts kicked in, and without a second thought, he rushed toward the scene. The woman's breath caught in her throat as she saw him approach. She felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was mixed with confusion. How had he found her so quickly? Was he watching her? Was he following her? In the midst of everything that was happening, she didn't have time to ask questions. All she could focus on was the fact that her husband was here, and he would make everything stop. Her husband's steps were quick, purposeful, and as he neared them, he called out to the officer. His voice was steady, controlled, but there was no mistaking the authority in his tone. "Step away from my wife," he commanded. The officer, now realizing that someone was intervening, turned his head slowly. He froze for a moment, as if trying to process the situation. The tension in the air seemed to shift slightly, and for a brief moment, everything stood still. The woman's husband stepped forward, his presence undeniable and powerful, and the officer, still standing in front of the wheelchair, hesitated. The officer's hesitation was brief, but it was enough for the woman to catch her breath. She had been holding it for what felt like an eternity, trapped between the officer's silence and her husband's commanding presence. As soon as she heard her husband's voice, she felt a rush of emotions flood through her. Relief, fear, confusion, all at once. She had always known that her husband, an FBI agent, was trained to handle high-pressure situations, but in that moment, she realized just how much that training meant. Her husband, standing tall and confident, locked eyes with the officer. The officer, still holding the wheelchair, now appeared uncomfortable. He wasn't used to this kind of confrontation, especially with someone who had such authority. His grip on the woman's wheelchair loosened slightly as he looked between her and her husband. There was no mistaking the change in the atmosphere. The sense of control was slipping away from him. The woman's husband took another step forward, his voice calm but firm. "I said, step away from her." His words carried the weight of his position, and the officer finally took a step back, his expression shifting from one of confusion to one of uncertainty. It was clear now that he wasn't prepared for what was unfolding before him. The woman, still in her wheelchair, was trying to process the situation. She could feel her heartbeat returning to normal, but it was hard to shake off the lingering fear. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the wheels of her chair, the tension in her body slowly unwinding. Her husband, despite the calmness in his voice, had a look in his eyes that told her everything would be okay. He was here, and no matter what, he would make sure she was safe. The officer, now clearly aware that he was in the presence of someone far more powerful than himself, seemed to falter. His eyes flickered toward the woman's husband, recognizing him for who he was. The calm authority of the situation was enough to make the officer start second-guessing his actions. What had he been thinking when he approached her so aggressively? He wasn't sure anymore. His initial reaction had been impulsive, driven by something he couldn't quite name. But now that he saw the man standing before him, he understood that he had crossed a line. The woman's husband took a deep breath, letting the tension settle for a moment. He didn't shout or make threats. Instead, he addressed the officer with a controlled tone. "I'm an FBI agent, and this is my wife. You have no right to treat her like this. Do you understand?" The officer, who had been standing tall just moments ago, now looked like he was shrinking under the weight of his mistake. He muttered an apology, but the woman couldn't tell if it was sincere or if he was simply trying to cover his tracks. The woman's husband didn't seem to care either way. He was more focused on making sure his wife was okay, making sure this situation wouldn't escalate any further. The woman looked up at her husband, her eyes filled with gratitude and relief. She had always known he was protective, but seeing him in action like this, taking charge in a moment of crisis, made her feel safer than she ever had before. She couldn't help but reach out to him, her hand gently brushing against his. The officer, clearly out of his depth now, stood awkwardly, waiting for further instructions. The tension between the three of them was palpable. The woman, though shaken, could feel the situation shifting, moving toward an end. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but at least she knew her husband was there to handle it. And that was enough for her to feel a sense of calm slowly returning. The atmosphere around them was thick with tension as the officer stood, awkwardly shifting on his feet. The woman's husband continued to stare at him, his expression unchanging, but his presence was undeniable. The officer, now fully aware of the situation he had stepped into, seemed to regret his actions, but his words seemed trapped. He couldn't quite find the right way to address what had happened. The silence stretched between them, uncomfortable and heavy. The woman, still sitting in her wheelchair, glanced up at her husband, a sense of security slowly replacing the fear that had overwhelmed her moments before. She was shaken, but the calm and steady strength of her husband had given her the grounding she needed. She wasn't alone in this. He was right there beside her, protecting her with the quiet confidence that came from years of training and experience. Her husband turned his gaze from the officer to his wife, his tone softening slightly as he spoke to her. "Are you okay?" His voice was low, filled with concern. The woman nodded, offering him a small smile, but it was clear she was still rattled. She had been through so much in such a short time, and the aftereffects of the encounter lingered. But with his steady presence beside her, she felt the fear begin to melt away. The officer, now realizing how wrong he had been, took a hesitant step back. He cleared his throat and muttered another apology, but it didn't seem to carry much weight. He had made a mistake, and it was clear that the woman's husband wasn't going to let him off easy. The officer had acted without thinking, and now he was standing in front of someone who knew how to handle such situations with calm precision. The woman's husband didn't respond immediately to the officer's apology. Instead, he took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing slightly as he considered the situation. It wasn't just about what had happened. It was about making sure it didn't happen again. The officer needed to understand the gravity of his actions, and the husband wasn't going to let this slip away without a serious conversation. "You've made a mistake," the woman's husband said, his voice steady but firm. "You can't just approach someone, especially a pregnant woman, in the way you did. You need to remember that there are consequences to your actions." His words weren't harsh, but they were clear. The officer needed to understand the full extent of his error. The woman, though grateful for her husband's words, could sense the underlying tension. She knew he wasn't doing this to make the officer feel bad, but rather to make sure such an encounter never happened again. The officer, realizing the weight of the situation, nodded in understanding. I didn't mean to. I'm sorry." His voice faltered, his confidence shaken. It was clear he wasn't used to being called out like this, especially not by someone with the authority and experience of the woman's husband. The woman, still processing everything, looked at her husband again. She had always known he was skilled at de-escalating tense situations, but seeing it in action made her admire him even more. He had a way of speaking that made people listen. He wasn't loud or forceful, but there was an undeniable power in the way he communicated. As the moment stretched on, the officer took a step back, his posture softening, and his eyes lowered in acknowledgement of his mistake. The woman's husband turned to her, giving her a reassuring smile. It wasn't a smile of triumph, but one of comfort, a reminder that everything would be okay. They were in this together, and together they would make sure that this situation didn't define the rest of their day. With the officer finally taking a step back, the woman felt the weight of the situation start to lift. She knew they couldn't undo what had happened, but she was grateful that her husband had stepped in when he did. His calm and measured response had turned what could have been a terrifying encounter into a reminder of just how important it was to stay grounded, no matter what came their way. The officer, now standing a few steps away, seemed to be waiting for further guidance. His body language, previously aggressive and assertive, was now defeated, as though he realized the enormity of his error. He shifted uneasily, looking at the woman's husband, who had not yet let up on his calm but firm demeanor. The husband's eyes remained steady, focusing on the officer with a quiet authority that could not be ignored. The woman, still sitting in her wheelchair, felt the tension ease just a little, but it was clear that the situation wasn't over yet. She wasn't sure how it would all end, but she knew that the officer's actions weren't going to be brushed aside. She wasn't someone who typically sought confrontation, but the way this officer had treated her made her feel like she had no choice but to stand up for herself. Her husband, sensing her unease, placed a hand on her shoulder, reassuring her without saying a word. Her husband's calm approach had already diffused the immediate danger, but the officer still needed to understand that this kind of behavior couldn't go unaddressed. "What you did was wrong," the husband said again, his voice more controlled now. He wasn't angry, but there was a seriousness in his words. "You can't treat people this way, especially not someone in her condition." The officer nodded again, his face flushed with embarrassment, but he didn't seem to fully understand what he had done. It wasn't just about his actions in that moment. It was about the impact they had on the woman in front of him. She was pregnant, vulnerable, and in a wheelchair, yet he had approached her with a mindset that was more about authority than understanding. It wasn't just about being in charge. It was about knowing when to step back and recognize when someone needed help, not control. The woman's husband continued, speaking slowly and clearly. "You need to be more aware of who you're dealing with. People are not threats because they're different, or because they don't fit into your idea of what's normal. People have their own stories, their own challenges. You can't just assume that everyone is a problem." There was a long pause as the officer absorbed the words. He seemed to be processing them, the weight of his actions slowly sinking in. The woman's husband wasn't shouting or trying to intimidate him, but the officer could feel the underlying message in his words. The responsibility to protect and serve wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was about understanding and respecting others. The woman sat quietly, watching the exchange. She had been through so much in such a short time, but the moment her husband arrived, she felt a sense of relief. She wasn't alone. She knew he was handling the situation with professionalism, but also with compassion. She couldn't help but feel a small sense of pride in him. She had always known that he was good at his job, but seeing him like this, calm, understanding, and protective, made her feel even more secure. The officer, realizing the magnitude of his mistake, looked down at the ground for a moment, as if ashamed of how he had acted. I'm really sorry," he said again, his voice quieter this time. There was a sincerity to his apology, but it was clear that the damage was done. He had acted on impulse, and now he had to face the consequences of his actions. The woman's husband nodded, his tone softening slightly. "I know you didn't intend to cause harm, but it's important that you learn from this. You need to remember that the way you approach people matters." He wasn't being harsh, but he was making it clear that this wasn't something to be forgotten. The officer needed to reflect on his behavior and learn how to handle similar situations better in the future. After a moment of silence, the officer finally seemed to realize that the conversation was coming to an end. He turned to the woman's husband and nodded once more, his expression apologetic. "I'll make sure this doesn't happen again," he said quietly. The woman's husband gave him a final, steady look before turning back to his wife. The officer's apology might not have been perfect, but it was a start. The woman was relieved that it was over, but she knew the situation wouldn't just disappear. She would never forget how vulnerable she had felt, how out of control the situation had been. But she was also grateful for her husband's presence, for his ability to diffuse a dangerous moment with calm and clear thinking. With a final nod, the officer turned and walked back toward his patrol car. The woman's husband stayed close to her, helping her adjust in her wheelchair. The street, once filled with tension, was slowly returning to normal, but the echoes of the encounter lingered in the air. It was a reminder that sometimes the smallest actions could have the greatest consequences, and that understanding, patience, and respect could make all the difference. The woman sat quietly in her wheelchair, her heart still racing from the encounter. The officer had walked away, and her husband, ever the steady presence beside her, had guided her down the street, their steps now in sync. The weight of what had just happened hung in the air, yet it was hard to shake the feeling that it wasn't quite over. Despite the officer's apology and the calmness her husband had brought to the situation, she couldn't help but feel unsettled. The moment had shaken her, and she wasn't sure how long it would take for her to truly feel safe again. Her husband could sense the unease radiating off of her. He didn't say much, simply walking beside her, offering the occasional reassuring glance, but it was clear he was deep in thought. He was a man of few words, especially when things were still raw. He had done his part, calming the officer, making sure that she was safe, but he knew this wasn't a situation that would be easily forgotten. His mind raced with questions about how things had escalated so quickly and whether he could have done anything differently. But he pushed those thoughts aside for now, focusing on his wife, who was more important than anything else. The walk back to their home was a quiet one. The street was still peaceful, but the world seemed different somehow. The woman's husband felt a sense of protectiveness stronger than ever. He wasn't sure what had driven the officer to act the way he did, but he knew that it was a reminder of the unpredictability of life. Things could change in an instant, and you never really knew who you were going to encounter on any given day. He had spent years training for moments like this, but no amount of training could have prepared him for the vulnerability he felt when he saw the way his wife was treated. That feeling stuck with him, making the silence between them all the more noticeable. After a few more moments of walking, the woman's husband spoke up, breaking the silence. "Are you sure you're all right?" His voice was gentle, filled with concern, but there was an underlying tension there, one that had not quite lifted. The woman looked up at him, meeting his gaze. She could see the worry in his eyes, and she didn't want to add to his concerns, but she couldn't hide the emotions that still lingered inside her. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice soft. She didn't want to admit just how shaken she was. She didn't want to worry him more than he already was. But the truth was, she felt vulnerable in a way she hadn't before. The fear that had gripped her in those moments when the officer had approached without warning hadn't completely faded. Her husband reached out, gently resting his hand on her arm, a gesture that brought her some comfort. "You don't have to be fine," he said, his voice warm. "It's okay to feel shaken. It's okay to take your time to process it." The woman nodded, her throat tightening. She appreciated his words, but it was still hard to admit the toll it had taken on her. She had spent so many years dealing with her own challenges, living with the reality of her pregnancy and her disability, and she had learned to navigate the world with a sense of independence. But today had reminded her that, sometimes, the world wasn't kind. She hadn't asked for this kind of attention, but it had been thrust upon her. The couple continued walking in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. The tension had shifted. It was no longer the heavy, uneasy quiet of before, but one filled with a deep understanding between them. They didn't need to say much. They knew what the other was feeling, even if the words weren't there. As they finally reached their home, the woman felt a small sense of relief. It wasn't that the situation had been resolved, but being home, surrounded by the familiar comfort of their space, made everything feel a little safer. Her husband held her inside, his hand steadied as he carefully guided her to the couch. He sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders. "We'll talk more about this later, when you're ready," he said softly. "But for now, just know that you're safe here." The woman closed her eyes for a moment, leaning into his embrace. She didn't know what the future held, and she didn't know how long it would take to move past what had happened. But for now, she had what she needed: her husband, her home, and the knowledge that they could face anything together. She wasn't alone, and that made all the difference. The days following the incident felt strange for the woman. The world outside her home seemed almost the same, yet something had changed inside her. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, not just by others, but by herself as well. Her mind kept replaying the events over and over. The officer's approach, his grip on her wheelchair, the confusion, and the fear that had washed over her. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized how much the presence of her husband had meant in that moment. He had been her rock, standing firm, not just in his role as an FBI agent, but as someone who deeply cared for her. Her husband, too, had been changed by the experience, though he didn't always show it. He had always been protective, but this was different. The encounter had reminded him of the unpredictability of life and how quickly things could spiral out of control. His thoughts lingered on what had happened, but he didn't voice them often. He knew that it wasn't just about confronting the officer anymore. It was about the deeper implications, the vulnerability of the woman he loved, and how fragile their world could be. They spent the next few days in relative silence. It wasn't that they didn't want to talk about what had happened. It was simply that neither of them felt ready. The weight of it was still there, hanging between them like an unspoken truth. The woman was trying to regain her sense of normalcy, even as she continued to deal with the aftereffects. She went back to her usual routine, though it didn't come as easily as before. She found herself looking over her shoulder more often than she liked. Her husband, ever vigilant, noticed this and made a point to stay close to her, offering reassurances with his presence. One afternoon, as they sat together in their living room, her husband spoke quietly, breaking the silence that had filled their home since the incident. "We can't just let this go," he said, his voice steady but filled with a sense of resolve. "What happened wasn't right. You know that, right?" The woman looked at him, surprised by the intensity in his tone. She had expected him to be patient, to let time heal, but she could hear the urgency in his words. He wasn't just concerned about the officer's actions. He was concerned about her. She nodded slowly, taking a deep breath. "I know," she replied softly. "I know it wasn't right, but I'm still processing everything. I don't want to let it control me, but it's hard." Her husband reached out, taking her hand in his. "You don't have to do this alone. Whatever you need, I'm here. But we have to make sure this doesn't happen again, not just to you, but to anyone." His words struck a chord deep within her. She had always been independent, preferring to face her challenges head-on. But this was different. This time, her voice mattered. What had happened wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a reminder that the world around them could be unpredictable, and at times, unsafe. She had a right to stand up for herself, and she wasn't going to let fear hold her back. "I agree," she said, her voice gaining strength. "It wasn't right, and I don't want anyone else to feel the way I did. Maybe it's time to do something about it." The idea of taking action felt both empowering and daunting. They both knew that addressing what had happened would require more than just words. It would take courage and persistence. The officer's apology was one step, but it wasn't enough. There was a bigger issue at play, one that wasn't just about one man's mistake. It was about a system that needed to do better, one that needed to be held accountable. In the days that followed, the woman and her husband began to discuss their options. They knew that they couldn't just let the incident slide, even if it was uncomfortable. The woman started to feel a sense of purpose that she hadn't felt before. She was more than just a victim of the situation. She was someone who could make a difference. And with her husband by her side, she knew they could face whatever came next. Together, they reached out to the right channels, making sure that the incident was properly reported. They wanted to ensure that the officer faced consequences, but more importantly, they wanted to raise awareness about the need for better understanding and sensitivity when it came to people like her, vulnerable, pregnant, and in need of respect. It wasn't an easy road, but she felt stronger with each step she took. By the time the week was over, they had begun the process of filing a formal complaint. The woman felt a weight lifting off her shoulders, and for the first time in days, she could breathe a little easier. She wasn't just letting the situation define her anymore. She was taking control of her own story. The days after they had filed the formal complaint were filled with a sense of anticipation. The woman knew that the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but something within her had shifted. She wasn't just going through the motions of getting back to normal anymore. She was determined to see this through. She had felt helpless during that encounter with the officer, but now, by taking action, she was regaining control of the situation. Her husband, always by her side, had become her pillar of support. He had a way of making her feel strong, reminding her that her voice mattered and that she didn't have to stand alone in the face of adversity. But it wasn't just about the support he gave her. It was about the courage she had found in herself, the courage to speak up and to take a stand for what was right. As the days passed, the woman found herself growing more confident. She began attending meetings with her husband, speaking with officials, and sharing her story. It wasn't easy, and there were times when she felt her resolve waver, but she pushed through. Each time she shared what had happened, she could feel her strength growing, and the support she received from those around her was a constant reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. The officer, meanwhile, had been placed under investigation. The woman didn't know all the details, but she knew that the system was taking her complaint seriously. She had heard from others in the community who were also speaking out about their experiences, and it became clear that her story was part of a much larger conversation about how people in vulnerable situations were treated. But it wasn't just about accountability for the officer. It was about creating change. The woman started to realize that what had happened to her wasn't an isolated incident. There were others, people in similar situations, who had faced the same kind of treatment. She began to advocate for more training, more awareness, and more respect for individuals with disabilities and those who were pregnant. It was about changing the way people saw each other and how they interacted. With each passing day, her belief in herself grew stronger. She started to see that this wasn't just about one officer's mistake. It was about a bigger, more important shift. She wasn't just a victim. She was someone who could make a difference, someone whose voice could inspire others to speak up as well. One evening, after a long day of meetings, she sat down with her husband on their couch. The silence between them was different now. It wasn't filled with the weight of unspoken words, but rather the contentment of knowing they were both on the same page. The woman leaned into her husband, resting her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart. He had been her protector, her strength, but he had also been the one to help her find her own voice. "We're getting there," he said softly, his arm around her, pulling her closer. She nodded, feeling the warmth of his presence. "I know," she replied, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's not over yet, but we're making progress. It feels like we're doing the right thing." Her husband smiled, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "You've done more than anyone could have asked of you. I'm proud of you." The woman closed her eyes, allowing herself to finally feel the relief she had been holding back. The journey wasn't finished, but she knew now that it was worth it. She wasn't just advocating for herself, but for others who had faced the same kind of mistreatment. And as long as she had her husband by her side, she felt ready to face whatever came next. The officer's actions had been the catalyst for something much bigger than she had ever expected. But in the end, it was about making sure that people like her, vulnerable, pregnant, and in need of respect, were treated with the dignity they deserved. It was about changing the world, one step at a time, and she was no longer afraid to take that first step. Together, they would make sure that no one else had to feel the way she had. It was just the beginning, and she was ready for whatever came next.